Hello there. Welcome back to another episode of Anything with Alvin. Today we're going to be recreating the famous chocolate chip cookies from Levain Bakery here in New York. Now, Levain Bakery has been an institution of the city well known for their really large and thick cookies. I've always been curious about how they're able to achieve such texture and size with their cookies because they seem quite not similar to a lot of the other chocolate chip cookies out there. So I thought this would be a fun opportunity to go visit the shop, try it out, and really get into the details of how we can do this at home. This episode is sponsored by Bombas, aka the most comfortable socks I've ever tried. And while they're comfy, the best part is that for every item purchased, one is donated. They've donated over 100 million articles of clothing so far across all 50 states. So you're not just getting your new favorite pair of socks, you're helping Bombas donate some to someone else too. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/babish and use code babish20 at checkout. So Tony and I adventured to a Levain bakery here in Brooklyn. They have a lot of locations in the city, but this one is also really nice to look at. When you go in, there's some fun facts on the walls about the owners and the founders and how they came up with the cookies. Apparently they created these cookie recipes when they were training for a marathon or a triathlon, which I think is a little counterintuitive, but also could go hand in hand. We looked at their display case, saw that they had the original lineup of cookies and also some seasonal specials. So trying to understand the whole spectrum of what we were going up against, we ordered quite a few of them, one or two of each to be exact, but we made sure to double up on the OGs. Alright, so here is our lineup of cookies. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys each one and give it a nice crack just to see the inside of it. First up, their classic one, the one that I think is probably the most famous, the chocolate chip walnut. Let's go ahead and take a look. Yep, very dense, got a nice round shape and loaded with stuff inside. And next up, I didn't know they had this one at the store, but they sold an oatmeal raisin one, which I think is actually an underrated flavor because I think the oats and the raisins are actually great seasonings for the cookie, but hey, that's a discussion for another time. Next up is their coconut chocolate chip one. This one is seasonal and they recommended it because, well, maybe because it's seasonal, but I personally do like coconut, so we got this one as well. Then onto their darker chocolate ones. There is a Rocky Road one, which I'm guessing has some nuts and some marshmallows in there, almost similar to s'mores and Rocky Road ice cream. Then the one that I'm more familiar with is the double chocolate chip cookie, a dark cocoa dough with chocolate chips inside. Pretty cool looking all around. I'm pretty sure I have had this one before and it's one of my favorites. Then a chocolate peanut butter one, same dough but with peanut butter chips instead of chocolate ones. Now that we've gotten an assortment of all the cookies from Levain Bakery, it's time to eat these and think through what's going on. So here are my thoughts. When you eat these, there's a really fun texture going on. So you kind of have a really deep contrast of almost like a really crusty cookie shell and a cookie dough center, which I think is what they're known for, and I think why it makes sense given that they're this size. I've also noticed that they don't really use chopped up chocolate chunks. They seem to only use specifically chocolate chips. My theory is that maybe because they tend to be on the sweeter side, they also have less cocoa content, and they usually have a cornstarch coating that lets it sort of stay together during the baking process. Maybe if they use chunks, it kind of would spread everywhere. So maybe the chips was an intentional choice to keep the size and the texture uniform across all those cookies. They all seem to be on the heavily sweet spectrum, a lot more to the right than personally I prefer, but hey, some people like that, and I think it almost tastes like a scone and a cookie had a baby together, which is a great thing. And I've noticed that in their chocolate dough, it's less of a deep dark chocolate flavor and it tastes more like fudge frosting kind of chocolate flavor, if you understand what I'm talking about. Having a little bit of sea salt on top definitely helps the flavor. I can also tell that the dough doesn't use any brown butter of any sort. It seems to be a very standard base, eggs, vanilla, flour, sugar. I don't taste any crazy flavors in here, which means that the dough is not highly aged or rested dough, which I personally do in my cookies. So it's really interesting to compare the different kinds of flavors and colors when it comes to these cookies. And overall, I need a sugar break because that's a lot of cookies. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on our attempt at recreating these, but hopefully a little bit tailored to my flavor profile preferences. First, I think if you're going to use butter in a cookie recipe, I do believe in brown butter. So we are going to make a lot of brown butter, enough brown butter to create many multiple batches of our cookies, because we are going to be attempting to do a lot of tests here. Some dark ones, some light ones, some with chips, some with chunks, so we're going to need a lot of butter. I'm going to brown a total of 9 cups of butter, which is 18 sticks Yeah, that's a lot of sticks, but hey, this is something I've done a lot. One thing that I like to do is actually go on a medium to medium low heat. I think often people brown butter a little too quickly and you do get those nice bits, but you run the risk of burning. I think it's important for one, once you get the water out, to be constantly stirring the butter so that the sediment that resides and settles to the bottom, one, doesn't stick to the pan and burn, but two, gets broken up so all the foam that's sitting on the top gets a chance to be reincorporated and re-swirled into the hot butter. This actually does take a little bit more time than you might expect, especially when you're browning 18 sticks of butter. I think this took us at least 25 minutes on a medium to medium low heat. A pastry chef once told me that you should actually take brown butter a little farther than typical color. People usually stop when the butter is golden and you see some brown bits. He told me that you should actually look like the color of Guinness beer, so a pretty dark color, not burnt, but I guess that's the nuance of it. You kind of want to get it to as close of that look as possible without burning the butter. So that is what I'm going to precisely do. And he also said that if you need to brown the butter, you should stop when you're 90% sure it's done, because it'll carry over at 10% with the residual heat left in the pan, because this thing is really hot since there's no water. So once we've gotten to that stage, another important thing is to try to reconsider the addition of water back into the brown butter. Because I'm using brown butter and not butter, I'm losing about 15% of the weight in water, which is going to evaporate. So in order to add that back in, I like to add ice cubes, because one, that cools the butter down, and two, it also just helps add the water back into the butter. Now here's an example of what happens when you add the ice cube too early. This part is pretty dangerous, but once you add basically water to a really hot pool of fat, you're going to get this. The water is going to melt, then evaporate into steam, and that's going to cause a lot of bubbling and foaming. But I'm showing you this because we're eventually going to dump our butter onto a tray to cool anyway, so I'm just going to let it overflow and spill onto a tray. But if you're doing this at home, I would suggest waiting a good 5 to 10 minutes for your butter to just naturally cool off on the stove before adding any sort of ice. Make sure don't agitate it, because once you throw in a couple more ice cubes and shake it up, you're going to get even more foaming. So that's, yeah, it's quite a lot. You don't want to waste all that work you've done, but we're doing this because it's going to go on the tray anyways. And so once we're done letting that butter settle down, I'm going to scrape out all those little bits and let the butter sort of evenly distribute itself on a sheet tray before putting that into the freezer to solidify. All right, so for our cookie mix-ins for all of the batches that we have, one thing I do want to test is testing chips versus chunks. I'm going to take some nice dark chocolate that we got at the store, chop that into chunks, because that's what I usually do when I bake stuff with chocolate in it, and set that aside. And here are our mix-ins. We have chocolate chips, we have chocolate chunks, we have walnuts, we have toffee bits, and we have peanut butter chips. The toffee bits is for a personal for fun batch that I just want to try off to the side. Not really relevant to the recipe, but kind of more similar to what I like in a cookie, because also I am allergic to walnuts, so I won't be able to taste test that one. Okay, our butter has been set in the freezer for about 30 minutes or so until it is completely solidified. So we're going to take this out and sort of scrape that into a bowl and whisk that together, because even though it's frozen, it's actually not evenly mixed. A lot of the sediment, as you'll see, is on the bottom half of all this butter, and the more fat side is on the top. So we have to make sure we get out all those bits, mix it together, and sort of emulsify this until it becomes more of an even brown butter spread. Otherwise, if you use it, you might get uneven ratios of the flavor bits versus the fat. Okay, now because we're doing multiple batches, I'm going to separate this based on weight. Half of this is going to be split for the light dough batch, which is the classic chocolate chip walnut cookie, and half of this is going to be split for the dark dough batches, which is going to be both the double chocolate chip and the peanut butter version. So after splitting that based on weight and doing some math, I'm going to put these back into the freezer to solidify once more. All right, let's get started with the light dough version, the classic version. So first I'm going to chop up the brown butter that we have separated out for this. This is going to be 2.5 cups of brown butter. Going to chop these into little cubes as if we were cubing up normal chilled butter into small cubes. And then I'm going to add that into a stand mixer with 2 cups of light brown sugar, 1 cup of white sugar, and whip that until it is starting to cream a little bit. I want to make sure that the butter and the sugar have enough time to kind of get to know each other, but not really stick to the sides, or else that means the butter is getting a little bit too warm. Then I'm going to beat in 4 eggs, 1 tablespoon of vanilla extract. Once that's all mixed together, then I'm going to add our dry ingredients. That's going to be 360 grams of cake flour, 340 grams of all-purpose flour, 1 tablespoon of cornstarch, and 2.5 teaspoons of baking soda, along with 1 tablespoon of salt. Now that we have our base light cookie dough ready, I'm going to split this dough up for 2 tests. One is going to be with chocolate chips and walnuts, and one is going to be with chocolate chunks and walnuts. After the dough has been split accordingly, we're going to do our mix-ins. Mixing in 1/3 cup of walnut pieces to about 2 cups of chocolate chunks. After the dough has been chilled a little bit, I've learned that it's important to really work with cold cookie dough. Hot cookie dough or room temp cookie dough just really doesn't get you anywhere good. We're going to be splitting this into pretty large cookie dough balls. People say it's around 6 ounces or so. I'm going to aim between 6 to 7. And I'm going to split these into not super round balls, but almost a textured craggly surface where if you roll the ball and you almost split it in half and invert it on itself, you get more of that chunky looking outside feel because there's some heavy degree of browning, but the inside still remains nice and moist. I believe that these cookies are cooked at a convection at a pretty high temperature. I'm guessing not your typical 350, probably higher. So I'm going to set this at 390 degrees convection. And we're going to cook these a little shorter than normal, only for about 10 minutes or so, keeping an eye on them the whole time. I'm also going to bake half of this dough at about chilled temperature and half of these at a frozen temperature to see if that results in any difference. Okay, so taking these out of the oven, there is a massive difference compared to what Levain cookies look like. These are really nice looking cookies with beautiful pools of chocolate and a nice shape and craggliness to them, but it's not that scone cookie-like texture that we're looking for. My guess is it had to do with the chocolate. Maybe there is a reason why they use chocolate chips and not actual chopped up chocolate chunks. And between the chilled versus frozen batch, there's a slight spread difference. The chilled one did spread a little bit more compared to the one that was frozen for 20 minutes. Because these do have the walnuts in them, I can't eat them. So I'm asking Kendall to come over and help me taste test these. Kendall gives her a thumbs of approval, which means a lot because she really knows her baking and is an excellent baker herself. So as long as Kendall likes it, we're good to proceed. All right, so now we're gonna test chocolate chips instead of chocolate chunks. We have the same light base dough as earlier with the same ratios, and then we're going to mix in again a 1/3 cup of chopped walnuts and 2 cups of chocolate chips, repeating the same exact process, mixing the dough together, letting this chill, dividing it into 6-ounce balls with a nice craggly edge, having to tear the dough at some points to make sure that it's nice and uneven. Chill that again, save half for chilled, half for frozen, and then bake this at 390 degrees Fahrenheit for about 10 minutes or so. Okay, so here is where you notice a significant difference. The one with chocolate chips held their stout, puffy shape that is close to the texture and look of the Levain cookie, but the one that was not frozen actually spread out a ton. So even the fact that frozen versus chilled dough is making a huge difference does speak to the way that cookies do bake in the oven based on their starting temperature. But comparing our version to Levain's, ours is significantly puffier. It doesn't really have that same chunky, craggly look. It's a little bit darker, probably because of the brown butter. It's a little bit smoother. It's almost got a more rounded kind of shape, a little more tender, and if you crack that open, you kind of see it's a little bit more of that like ooey gooey soft looking cookie dough versus that chunky cookie dough that the Levain one has. My guess is that maybe because we used too much baking soda, maybe we used brown butter instead of regular butter, could have also caused a difference, but we did compensate with water, so I'm not really too sure about that. But also my biggest theory is that if you're baking as many cookies as Levain does, you probably need to be making a lot at a time, and you might have the space and time to let the cookies just sit in the fridge or the freezer to let their exterior dry out. So when you do bake them, you really get a head start on that nice crust on the outside. And Kendall also discussed the same things with us and agreed that maybe lowering the baking soda and testing out drying it out in the fridge and the freezer could be a good revisit. So we're going to tackle that later on in this video. But in the meantime, we're going to first get started on our chocolate dough recreation attempts. We're going to use the same brown butter that we divided earlier. This recipe has slightly different ratios. So we're going to have 2 cups of brown butter cubes that we're going to chop up and throw into a stand mixer, 2 cups of brown sugar, 1 cup of white sugar, 4 eggs, a teaspoon of vanilla extract, 1 cup of special dark cocoa powder. That's kind of like that black cocoa powder that you use to make really black looking chocolate foods like Oreos and stuff like that. We're going to be using that along with a tablespoon of espresso powder, 240 grams of cake flour, 390 grams of AP flour, 2 teaspoons of cornstarch, teaspoon of baking soda, and 2 teaspoons of salt. Now we have a really dark dough that is going to be a good base, and we're going to split this dough similarly to the other one and do half of that with 2 cups of chocolate chips and half of that with 2 cups of peanut butter chips. People said the Reese's peanut butter chips specifically need to be used for this recipe, so we have acquired those. After the same process, chilling the dough, separating it out onto a tray into craggly balls, freezing it again, here is the result. Ours is on the right, Levain is on the left. So ours is significantly darker than theirs. I think maybe our usage of special dark cocoa powder was too high, or maybe we should have just used really high quality cocoa powder, more Dutch processed in a different ratio to achieve the less of a black look, more of a dark brown look. But it's not burnt, it's actually just really dark cocoa powder. Our texture is still slightly puffier than the one that Levain does, but it has more of the craggly texture than our chocolate chip walnut cookies, so maybe there's something to be said about the way cocoa powder affects the baking. When you analyze the taste, ours tastes more similar to what I like in a chocolate cookie. It has a deeper, more satisfying, complex chocolate flavor where you can really taste the notes of chocolate and the salt. And Levain's cookie tastes more like hot chocolate or like fudge frosting chocolate if you like that flavor. Not a bad thing, just, it's maybe like a store-bought chocolate cake kind of flavor. But definitely a little bit closer on the attempt here in terms of texture and size. It has more of that shape that we want. And also a fun batch that I made off to the side. This is the same exact light dough ratios, but instead I mixed in a cup of toffee bits and 2 cups of chocolate chunks, because that is kind of similar to what I like in my own cookie, and I also can't eat walnuts. So this one is going to be a personal one for me. But hey, this is how it turned out. I do like it. I like the flavor. The size is also very close to the typical Levain cookie, and these actually sat in the freeze the longest. So my hunch is that our idea about freezing and letting the cookie dough chill and sort of dry out, leading to that craggly texture, is more spot on after each attempt. But we still need to give the classic chocolate chip walnut recipe one more shot. Alright, so now it is a different day. Rachel went ahead and helped prep some cookie dough balls ahead in advance. This time we modified the recipe, all white sugar, no baking powder. And the most important thing is that these cookie dough balls were left to age in the fridge and another batch in the freezer, just lightly covered, just to see if we can dehydrate the surface to get that craggly texture we're looking for. Once these go in a tray, we're going to bake them like before and show you guys the result. Also, I forgot to show you guys the cross section of those chocolate peanut butter cookies that we made. A little flatter than Levain's version, but once we crack them open, they still taste even better than I think the one we got at the store. I personally took a lot of these home later. Okay, now that our modified chocolate chip cookie dough has baked, there's quite a significant difference. It's definitely looking closer to the original version that we got at the bakery. There's more of that craggly crust. The shape is correct. There's no puffiness at all. And I think our modifications stood true. So definitely not using baking powder or baking soda gets you close to the result. And it's crazy how different the freezer one looks than the fridge one. I'm guessing the fridge one got a little bit more ground and crusty because the fridge is better at dehumidifying, and freezer might just freeze the ice crystals from the moisture and lock those in rather than drying it out in the fridge. And when I felt the fridge ones, they definitely felt like scone things before you bake them. So I think that's good learning as well. But to be fair, they almost look quite identical. Let's crack them open and give them a look. Maybe we could have used a little bit of brown sugar. I think going all white sugar is a little too much and the color is a little too pale. So definitely reverting back to adding a quarter of that sugar in brown sugar definitely makes a lot more sense. As far as flavor wise, I can't eat these because I am allergic to walnuts. So Rachel's gonna have to do that for me. She says that it is a very, very, very similar. Levain still has a really, really nice shiny craggly sugar crust on the top. And we're talking about how that could be from going to freezer to fridge, where maybe some of the condensation pools at the top melts a little bit and freezes again, and that causes the sugar crystals on the top to melt, and then when you bake it you get a crust. But who knows? All I know is that this is probably the closest version we've gotten so far compared to all the recipes that we've seen online, so I'm pretty happy with this. At the end of the day, we made a lot of cookies, and these will always need a home to go to. So just to make sure that everybody is happy in the studio, we packed them a little goodie bag of each assortment of cookies that we made, both homemade, both from the shop. And at the end of the day, no cookie was left behind. I think that's the moral of the story here. This episode is sponsored by Bombas, aka the most comfortable socks I've ever tried. And while they're comfy, the best part is that for every item purchased, one is donated. They've donated over 100 million articles of clothing so far across all 50 states. So you're not just getting your new favorite pair of socks, you're helping Bombas donate some to someone else too. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/babish and use code babish20 at checkout.